good evening. Welcome to this launch event by Fleur Adcock, Tiffany Atkinson, Aoife Lyall and Susan Wicks of their new poetry collections, which are being published by Bloodaxe this week on Thursday. The format we're going to have tonight is that each of the poets will read for 6 or 7 minutes, followed by the next poet, the next poet, the next poet, and then we'll return again for further readings in the same order. And because we've got 4 poets reading tonight, I'm going to keep my introductions short. So with the first poet who's going to read tonight is Fleur Adcock. Fleur was born in New Zealand, but spent the war years in England. She emigrated to Britain from New Zealand in 1963 and has since been rooted both here and there. She lives in London. She began writing the poems in this new book when she was 82. The 2 chief settings are New Zealand, with its multicolored seas, and Britain, seen in various decades. And there are foreign travels, flirtations, family memories, deaths, and conversations with the dead. Katherine Mansfield, Incognito, dodges an academic conference. There's a lesson in water divining, as well as a rather unusual Christmas party. We meet several varieties of small mammal, numerous birds, doomed or otherwise, and some sheep. And the book itself ends with a sequence in memory of her friend, the poet Roy Fisher. So would you please welcome Fleur Adcock, who's going to read from her new collection, The Mermaid's Purpose. Fleur.
Thank you very much, Neil. I think I'm back in, sorry. I started writing my first collection of poems 80 years ago when I was 7, and this is it. It's a little notebook covered with brown paper. It's got the calendar for 1941 inside the cover, and on the outside it says poetry book, and there's a picture of a fairy. You can't really see the fairy because she's faded a bit. The pencil's very faint, but I can tell you she's got a wand in one hand and a handbag in the other. And I presume the handbag is the equivalent of the mermaid's purse in the title of my current book of poems, which also has a mythical being on the cover. And she looks like this. J.W. Waterhouse's painting. It's much better than mine at 7. I'm going to begin by reading the title poem, and it's a rather different concept of a mermaid. The Mermaid's Purse. The mermaid's purse, when you pick it up, is full of squirmy sea larvae. She doesn't carry actual money, but then she's not an actual mermaid, actuality not being a possible attribute of mermaids. 3 times I crossed the equator, by water that is, flying doesn't count. The coloured surface is camouflage, underneath is black, black and heaving. Rat's nest in the diver's helmet. Why then they must be sea rats. So where do we go from here? Down, down, where the eels go. Don't wait for me, I'll be along later. Down, down. Think of me supping at mermaid's milk as you shrink into your philosophy. The mermaid's child will be a dogfish. Next one also has sea in it. This is Island Bay, and it's one of the bays in Wellington that I'm very fond of. I was back there towards the end of 2019, and I went to gaze at it. Bright specks of neverlastingness float at me out of the blue air, perhaps constructed by my retina, which these days constructs so much else, or by the air itself, the limpid sky, the sea drenched in its turquoise liquors, like the power shells we used to pick up 70 years ago, 2 bays along from here, under the whale's great jaw. The jawbone of a whale was actually it's standing upright like an archway on the end of the beach where my sister and I used to go to look for shells at Moa Point. This is another family poem in a way. This one's called The Fur Line. It's for my great number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. When I was working in the factory, stitching open-ended zip fasteners at one of a row of sewing machines, someone brought in some kittens in a box. I didn't wait to consult my husband. I travelled home on the tram after work with Jonathan snuggled in my bosom. We had a cat before we had a child. Sally and Midge, Pussy Willow, Ada, all that fluff got into our synapses, transmitting itself down generations, from nerve to nerve, or however it works. Tiger and Snowflake, Marigold and Prince. Too late to say I've gone off predators in favour of protecting the bird life when I've bred a tribe of ailurophiles. It's out of my hands. This is the future. Brucey, Melba, Sasha, Lady Gaga. It's no surprise that my great-granddaughters grow up co-sleeping with their mother's cats. And from cats to mice. I've got wood mice living outside my back door under the trees where the bird feeders are. They forage on the seeds from the bird feeders, but not so good when they come into the house, which has been known. So this is addressed to them, or about them. It doesn't actually use many pronouns. It's wood mice. They'd better stop doing that, though, if they want to go on living here, running up the stairs in kangaroo hops, a big leap for mouse kind, nibbling at everything from stationery to paracetamol, shinning up the striped ladder of the Tradescantia to chew on its translucent stem joints as if they were celery, the cheek of it, and playing hide and seek under the bureau, then galloping down again, a sight to see, their little bandy legs viewed from behind. Otherwise, it's into a box with them, a humane one, of course, and down to the woods for a new life. But it has been known to go wrong, alas, oh alas, which tends to make the householder more sentimental than might otherwise be. So in the meantime, pending reform, a discreet crumble of toast or a few peanuts under the cooker for big ears in the night. And I'll end this section with a poem that refers to the last big lockout I lived through, which was World War II in Sidcup. And this is the Little Theatre Club. 1945. The principal boy, Ninette, nee Edith, 70 this year, hauls out her costume trunk again. It's time to shroud her bony shanks in the green tights that have served her well since before the war. Now there's no blackout, more children will come to watch this thing they'll call a pantomime. No, they won't think of it as magical. It won't out-magic The Wizard of Oz or other films they've seen at the Regal. But they'll cotton on to the convention of gender swapping, loving its daftness. Who's the dame? It will have to be Anton, Ninette's husband, parading his bosom. And they'll giggle at the grown-ups having fun. And what will you remember, my young dears? Will it be the lights, the smell of makeup, the topical jokes about coal rationing and Mr. Attley? It will be those tights, apple green and wrinkled about the knee.
Thank you, Fleur. We've actually got 4 generations of poets here tonight, so it's quite unusual to have this many wonderful poets from different, who started their writing time at different times. And we're already getting chat in from around the world. We've got poets, we've got people watching in Derbyshire, Limerick, Wellington, New Zealand, Liechtenstein, Munich, Brooklyn. So we're really getting out there. The second poet who's going to read tonight is Tiffany Atkinson, who'll be reading from her 4th collection, Lumen, which asks how poetry might help us articulate the body in illness, in work, and in love. The book includes the prize-winning sequence Dolorimita, which takes fragments of speech and found text from a hospital residency she did to pay homage to the inventiveness and humour of patients and staff in a series of meditations on the notion that pain resists language. Away from the wards, other poems consider the strangeness of the workplace and the embarrassing incursions of desire into everyday life, celebrating the ability of poetic language to lay awkwardness and uncertainty alongside unexpected openings and glimpses of revelation. Tiffany lives in Norwich, where she teaches at the University of East Anglia, and Lumen is a Poetry Book Society recommendation. So would you please welcome Tiffany?
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. Good evening, everybody. Can't see anyone, but I'm hoping there are people out there. And thank you, Neil, for publishing Lumen. So I thought I'd read a few poems in this first part from the sequence that was based on the medical residence, the hospital residency. And the first one is the one where the word lumen reveals itself. I didn't know that it had a medical application. I think probably most of us know that it means a unit of light, but this poem describes the moment where I found out what it meant in a medical context. There's a nurse I followed around a lot during this residency called Pinky, and she appears in this poem. Clean windows. Sean, the new department manager, spends all the petty cash on window cleaners for these huge panes 6 floors up. They all have their foibles, says Pinky, shucking a glove with a smack. We're in the main ward, high and formal as an Oxbridge hall. A trolley turns a corner somewhere deep, and then, as if the hospital swings downwind and hangs on its anchor, calm rolls up the jinxy stairwells to this floor, where, through the hand-rinsed glass, we watch a white van climb out of the valley to the new world. What's a word for how the light, this cold May afternoon, ruffles the blue-pleated curtain behind Mr. Mooney, reaching for his tumbler like a man underwater? I have Lumen biroed on my hand because the nurse who used it scuttled off before I got to ask. What's a lumen, Pinky? Just an opening, she says. A lot of the time I was just listening to people talking and following them around with a notebook and putting together fragments later. This poem was a story told to me by a consultant who was recalling when he was much younger and how he treated somebody for chronic pain. And what he was describing was opiate-seeking behaviour and how hard it was to resist. And every time he was trying to describe what it was like, he ran out of words. So what it was like for this patient who was in the pain, he was saying it was like, and he couldn't finish that sentence. So this poem sort of tries to do that. It tries to think about what it might have been like. It's called Heroin Works. The consultant's tales fly out around corners and just before doors swing shut. Like one about a chronic painer, one of his first, and abdominal pain being one of the worst things. She was desperate, and all of her family desperate. In the house, the pain hung like laundry from each edge. You could walk in and feel it flap against your face. It was thick in some corners like meat, and there was nowhere else to put it. The mother was smoking silk cup back to back. The pain was like television left on loud in a room that you couldn't get into. The father was busy, and the pain was a baby that no one could find. The brothers were upstairs, all three, loudly, and the patient herself was glassy and still, just out of her teens with a face of clenched fingers. It was all like the mouth of a tunnel where no one could turn round and no one could carry on either, everyone daisy with fumes. And he, the consultant, then such a young man, knew he had to step up briskly, waving the bright umbrella, and drag them the hell to anywhere that wasn't this. So it was time to try it, he said. And the look on her face and how her eyes blew open like a door swung wide on a huge sky. Relief, he said, and not for her pain, but for a world restored, as if the house had burst into song, or a film where the family sits down to an ordinary breakfast and the doctor goes on his way, his white power throbbing on-off through his coat. While I was there was a lot of hanging around, and I found myself reading all kinds of really ancient medical literature left in the backs of offices and things like that. And in one of them, I found this reference to a mnemonic called Socrates, which has nothing to do with the philosopher, but apparently is a way of remembering the questions to ask a patient to find out about their pain. So S stands for the site, O for the onset, and C for the character of the pain, and so forth. So this poem is structured by taking that premise and laying against it fragments of things that I heard from people and that actually kind of came from my own memories as well. So this is the last poem I'll read in this section, called Socrates. Sight. Where is the pain? In the violet corners, under my tongue, at the root of language, at the bottom of my red bag, ringing all hours. Jesus, how can you ask that? Here, here, here. Onset. When did the pain start? I've thought about this a good while. My wife says round about the time we got back from Corfu, but I kept quiet for the first 4 billion years. Character. What is the pain like? Drama queen, bad dad, alien, vicious wee shite slinking up to the house with my fucking keys in its hand. Radiation. Does the pain radiate? But I'm flashing like a cursor, nail bomb, permanent terrorist broadcast from the bottom of the sea. Associations. Any signs or symptoms associated with it. Mother comes down to the garden in her headscarf with a handful of tubers. Go get your bucket and spade, my mouse, and help me dig them in. Time course. Does it follow any pattern? See history. See also structure of the novel, post-war. Exacerbating, relieving factors. Does anything change it? It is not an economy, marriage, weather system, tight shoe, or an untuned radio, but sometimes I watch as it turns on itself like a prom queen no one's watching. Severity. How bad is the pain? Let's take everything that's not the pain. Let's gather that and hang it out in daylight, can we? From the dark nail.
Thank you, Tiffany. Well, we're going to stay a little bit with hospitals with our next reader, Aoife Lyall. Aoife's launching her debut collection, Mother, Nature. This explores the tragic and tender experiences of pregnancy and early motherhood, from antenatal complications and the devastating pain of miscarriage to the overwhelming joy of healthy delivery and healthy infancy. Mother Nature is unusual as a first collection in that the whole book is about motherhood. Aoife was born and raised in Dublin, and she now lives in the Scottish Highlands. And before publication, we sent a copy of the poems to Holly McNeish because we thought that she might be interested in the book and might want to say something about it. And she very kindly gave us this comment on the book, which I'd like to read you. She wrote, "There are poems in this collection that knock me clean to the ground, as others offered me a warm hand up and others still, which stroked my backbone as I sobbed. The subject is crucial, but it's the beauty of the poems which hold it all together." And she quotes, "By law, she carries you," is a line that I will never get out of my skin. So now I'd like to welcome Aoife with some of those poems.
Hi Neil, thanks for having me here tonight and being someone who took on the book and all that involves. So the poems I will read are 5 poems from the beginning of the book, and they are to do with pregnancy, loss. And I know for some people that's not something that you want to maybe hear about just now. If you need to go and make a cup of tea, please go make a cup of tea. Okay. Signs of that day, after Norman McCaig. When a silence came, it was your heart not beating. When the door hushed, it was the shuffle of a midwife leaving us alone in our private grief. A muffled clanging 10 yards down the corridor was the news breaking and unbreaking in the filing cabinet. When the black biro rolled, it was me falling and falling into myself. When the door clicked shut behind us, it was the end of all the silences there were. They left us in the busiest corridor in the hospital. I thought I was hurt in my body only, not knowing that when your body sleeps, your mind feels all those kicks in your round stomach before you wake, and the whole world goes numb. Hospital canteen. It may be possible to give you a scan picture. Please bring exact money. Change cannot be given. Its shiny flat surface looks so fragile in the cashier's hands. I have to stop myself from telling her to hold it by the edges, from pointing out all the newness, how the otters' backs curve, how their soft faces turn, how their legs rest fluent and frozen in time, like the baby I never saw, on the screen as blank as the black coffee I cue to cradle in my hands, the change a secret, a cenotaph I leave for someone else to find. The grave diggers. Worn smooth, their shovels, picks, and sombre mattocks congregate by the tarpaulin shroud. It is slow work. They must be thorough. There must be width and breadth and scope for more. Normally a chatty bunch, they give the smallest graves their silence. Their job to turn this hallowed, hollowed ground of mine from grave to garden with the little dignity such deconsecration can afford. A labor of love, they pause to pay their last respects. Leave me with my immeasurable silence, expecting nothing in return. No flowers, by request. And still they come. The lilies burst like corpses, waft their death scent through the open house. Awake for weeks, I am the grave they send the lilies to. Exhumed and made ready, my body rich with loam, I watch them wither until they rot and stain my clothes. Until with my own hands I have to leave them in the garden to sink into the soil. The coffin brown lid of the compost bin nailed shut by a midwife's hands, florist smiles, black biros waiting for a signature. Month's mind. We don't know which ones we're meant to bring, so we settle on the yellows for all the sorries there are. We pick the smallest bunch, full of buds but no flowers. We lay them to rest in the river. Our slow footsteps mourn the dying shadows as we walk back to the house together and alone. Once home, we bury our good shoes at the bottom of the wardrobe. We pour the tea and unwrap plates of sandwiches and cake. In low voices, we talk a little about the life you never lived, and the house you never lived in is overwhelmed by all the people who didn't know to come.
Thank you, Aoife, for that very brave reading, those poems. I know that there'll be happier poems in the second part of your reading when you'll be reading poems about good times. To follow Aoife, we have Susan Wicks, and there will be connections there that we might explore in the discussion at the end, because the long title poem of her previous collection, The Months, interweaves between 2 pregnancies spanning 2 generations and ends with 2 births, which take that book in a new direction. In her latest book, Dear Crane, which is her 8th collection, the focus is very different. A giant construction crane, which appears at the back windows of a residential street, its beam swinging freely. Sorry, I've just thought I wasn't muted. I just thought I was still muted, and I've been talking without anyone hearing. Under the crane, new buildings spring up, seasons shift, perspective varies. Until its work completed, the giant machine is ready to be driven away. By the time it leaves, the landscape we knew will have changed, and we too will have moved on. Susan lives in Kent, which is where she's going to be reading to us tonight. Susan. Susan is still muted.
Not now. Right, as you've gathered in this book, there are a lot of poems about heavy machinery. There are also quite a few about aging and taking care of grandchildren. But I thought I'd start with the poem that gave me the initial idea. I mean, based on the incident that gave me the initial idea for the Dear Crane sequence. It's not part of the sequence, it's a poem on its own, but it's called Crane, and it's inspired by a publicity postcard that we had through our letterbox one day, which said, rather aggressively, I thought, how would you describe God in one word? So that's where this springs from. I tried divinity because it seemed to show no prejudice, a category for a certain kind of need, historical, a cultural contingency. I tried toast because my eyes were resting on the toaster at the time, and the toaster's shape was retro, making me remember weekend mornings lost in childhood dreaming by the solid fuel boiler in the kitchen corner. Then mother, since when she was still alive, I hadn't understood her, and with age, I feel myself grow closer, understand her better, thinking of her gently with a you, the way a child might say a prayer. Then I thought, why one when they have Father, Son, and Holy Ghost? And through the trees, I saw its steel-built tower, small red light, and concrete counterweight. I watched it turning in the prevailing breeze. This one was about looking after my elder grandson when he was about 2. It's called Emergency. You hear them more distinctly than I can. A helicopter circling above the M25, a plane that's coming into land at Gatwick, concrete mixer churning its wet load, pneumatic drill a house or 2 away. What do you make of them? Today you sit on your spring-mounted fish and rock and give me that huff puff of breath that means you're thinking of an ambulance. And I supply the rest. How yesterday in this same place we heard the siren, how today we hope it comes again, that someone else's fright or toxic shock or clenching heart will be a small, exciting sound that's swelling in the distance and then fades away. There are a lot of poems about tractors, but this one I think was written out of sheer embarrassment. It's for the same grandchild when he was about 3. embarrassment and then relief, because I felt I had said something very crass and I was somehow being forgiven. I couldn't work that out because I didn't have the belief that supported it, but that's what it felt like. So it's called Parable. We'd wandered in there just to get away from heat and sun. By the frosted door with its clear glass cross, you stopped and questioned me, "What for?" And I said, "That's what they did to criminals in those days, in that place," and bit my tongue. Then I told you not to worry, said, "He was the one who was the baby in the Christmas crib, remember?" And you said you didn't like that story very much. No wonder you tightened your small grip and asked to go outside. It was so hot. But crossing the grass to stand in buttercups and clover underneath the trees, we saw a little digger on a flatbed truck. You stood quite still and gazed, watching the men unfasten all its tethers one by one and back it gently down. We saw the driver come and with his key unlock the steel container shed where it would spend the night. We watched him tidy up the tools and drifts of scattered waste to give it room. And this is a tractor like no other. I'm going to end this section with this one when I find it. And it's based on a true incident. I was walking with my daughter on the edge of Exmoor. On the day of the royal wedding, the 19th of May, 2018. Walking all morning along sunken paths between banks of bluebells, ragged robin, primroses, we miss our way and stop beside a churchyard, open our blowing map, and with our index fingers trace our route from one field to the next, to where we strike uphill around the corner of a farmhouse into sunlight, past a square of rutted dirt where someone's parked a tractor, leaving it driverless. And it is praying, "Hallowed be thy name, give us this day, forgive us." The words rise and float free of the empty cab and up between the leaves towards the edge of Exmoor. No one here but us and this steep green with ewes and 3-month lambs scattered across a hillside like grey stones, until a man emerges, turns his still warm key in the ignition, and the voice we heard is drowned out by his engine as we walk away. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And we're now into our second part of the event, and I'll just introduce Fleur. Fleur.
Sorry, I just got muted. Something funny's going on. Can you hear me now? Yep. The host muted me. Right. In the second half, I'm going to read a lot of poems about death because there's a lot of it around in my time of life. And so I'll begin with one called Victoria Road. I'm saying to Meg and Alex, I came past your street this afternoon. I wanted to visit you, but you're dead. And Meg is saying in her sensible way, can't be helped, next time check up first. While Alex gives a sort of rueful smile, mouthing sorry as if through a window. I can't hear him, and flinging his hands out in apology, as when they met me at Kathmandu airport in a thunderstorm. Sorry about the rain. Sorry about the deaths, but let's not start. Anyway, now that we've established that, we can get on with the conversation. I'll show them the pictures I took of Meg beside the 2 saplings on a riverside walk in Stony Stratford where we planted Alex's ashes. We used to visit the swans around there. Alex will embark on a story about spotting his hero Graham Greene in the south of France and trying to pluck up courage. I think I may have heard it before, but I was never sure of the ending. This is a very short one for my cousin Stephanie, who died too young. It's called To Stephanie at 11 p.m. One last crumb of family history, dear cousin, all these months after your death. Our great-grandmother Martha used to say, night brings home all sorrows. So I find it. And this is one from my mother. And I thought Susan might like this one, or her grandson might like it, because it's got a cherry picker in it. It's called Lightning Conductor. On the 18th anniversary of my mother's death, I'd been watching a man in a vertiginous cherry picker attaching copper wire to the finials on the church roof. I'm pleased with myself for remembering the word finial, which I associate with a poem by Amy Clampett, but madly searching for the name of my mother's neighbour, who kindly let me lodge in her house on one of my visits to Wellington. When I was leaving it for the airport, the taxi, swinging around two corners, startled me with a glimpse of my mother, to whom I'd already said goodbye, walking firmly and with concentration in her familiar red dressing gown up the outside staircase to her flat. It was not my last view of her, but the last on that particular trip, and likely to outlive several others. Finial. It sounds like a fancy over-decorated word for final. Lightning is the least of my worries. And the next three, which will be the last three, are from the selection of poems at the end for Roy Fisher. This one's called Jade Plant. The plant has very many names. Jade Plant's one of them. A jade plant is the name of the poem, but actually the first line is this. This one's called The Pathetic Fallacy. The money tree you gave me in the form of a bulbous finger-length twig to bring home on the train in a margarine container, pot up in gritty compost, and watch expanding through slow, reliable decades, has spent these last weeks bending over, limb by stiff limb, trunk turning pliable, fat green oval jade coins dropping off in twiggy clusters of 3 and 4, as if it knew something, as if, what nonsense, it had decided to die. Do not resuscitate, you said once in another context. I shan't. This is an April bat. From the place where you are now, you sent me a bat. Thank you. I looked out of the pantry window to catch a glimpse of the sunset, rosy pink with pollution as it was, and there, circling and flipping low above my flowering trees, apple and lilac, was this bat. Birds we used to send each other, a woodpecker, a jay, but this is for the dark time. Don't think I value it less for being a cliché. You know I haven't a very original mind. You were generous enough to send me a thing I'd understand. And finally, porridge. I was thinking about that saucepan of yours, the Pyrex one, so improbable, made of amber glass, the colour of barley sugar. Not a utensil to be used on gas, I imagined, but on your electric cooker it squatted contentedly in its glory. Everything about it looked precarious, liable to melt into golden syrup as soon as it encountered heat, or explode into a shrapnel blitz of orange splinters. But of course it was tougher than that, solid, quaint with survival from an earlier age. All you had to do was not drop it too hard. I almost felt I was demeaning it by stirring mere porridge in it, but oh, the glow. Now that the house is cleared, it must be somewhere, safe in a crate perhaps, or a cardboard box, until whatever happens to it happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Fleur. I'll just wait till Fleur's muted. Thank you. Yes, and Fleur was one of the first poets published by Bloodaxe. In fact, 1979, Below La Frigue, a very early Bloodaxe publication. And later, we rescued her poetry when Oxford University Press shut its poetry list. And before that, we'd also rescued Roy Fisher. It was lovely to hear those poems about Roy at the end of her reading. So now we're going to go back to Tiffany Atkinson. Tiffany.
Thanks, Neil. I should just say that if someone had told me sort of 10 years ago that I'd be reading after Fleur Adcock at something, I would have fainted or sworn or both. So yeah, it's fantastic. I've just changed what I was going to read actually, because I was struck by Susan's comment about the how would you describe Jesus in one word or God in one word, and how random fragments like that can kind of take on an imagination or imaginative quality of their own. So the poem I'm going to read next is from a slip of the tongue in a meeting about arts funding or something, and someone said we should all be applying to the Department of Small Arts, and it was a slip of the tongue. I've no idea what it was meant to be, but I thought, yeah, I like the sound of the Department of Small Arts, you know, the kind of the marginal, the little, the irrelevant, and so on. The Department of Small Arts invites you to diminish applications. You may work in any medium, but are likely to prefer edges and the undergold. For example, you may listen for the blackbird. You may have at least one unresponsive parent. You may be among the peaceniks and the women. You may drive despite the terror. You may compliment the cashier's fishtail braids. You may spot the feathers at the roadside. You may rearrange the toys in party huddles. You may give the man your loose change. You may leave before the hostess is in tears. Should you entertain a huge idea, please delegate. We have no truck. Do load your sling with quanta. We remind you that the grant season blinks twice a year. Consider what has passed through. Annotation, milk and soft parentheses, a cardboard plinth, all secret names, bespoke and little lids that pop up with a puck, a strong historic present, slow and slow and slow and wait, let's. This is also from a fragment of overheard speech on the radio around the early days of the Me Too movement, and there was a lot of conversation on the radio about issues of consent. Consent. On the radio, it wasn't tyranny. She just said, all the men that have assaulted me in my life have been nice guys. In a voice that made me think of when your finger pushes through the cellophane and touches cool meat. Flesh, you think, with your flesh. I was cooking dinner like a citizen. The interviewer was like, whoa. I put the chicken down and walked outside. The lawn, the herbs, the ornamental tree. What a sharp and unexpected boredom. Have I? Have I given my consent? Oh, lazy girl, if you don't burn down suburbia, where can you go with a pretty mouth? Who will you bury in ankle-length yeses and pearls? Mum arises in the backdraft of my cigarettes, though so long into the dark herself, she has poor working syntax and is flat out knackered. Kid, she spells on the threshold. Even the wind that cannot count or bone a chicken knows its own mind. Because Fleur read some of her cat poems, a cat household poem, I'm going to read a dog household poem, just to even things up a bit. This is called Hymn, H-Y-M-M. Red dog shitting plants his 4 stars in the grass and up goes the tent of himself. His tail pegged out, his eyelids fine and private. And I think, so that's how we do all things with the body. Here he is. He lifts a gold wrist like a debutante. I look at him and know the eye emits a shaft of sticky particles, and these have formal consequences. When he hunts, in any case, I'm lost to him. He spins on the horizon, heads, tails. Smooth your hand along the dog. He likes that. If in dreams sometimes I do my red dog harm, I wake in thick tears. If my dog lies like spilt honey, I stretch across the carpet breath to breath and watch his yellow eye, a trapdoor in and out of which some small hot thing is always bolting, flick and grow still. May I never get over the slapstick of the red dog swimming. When high wind is the red dog's cinema, he shakes. Only when my dog is quite exhausted will he push his India rubber heart into my palm. It jumps. When friends say, look, you know he's not a substitute, do they think I'm an idiot? He chooses daily, and I rise or don't rise, and he takes me. And finally, a poem that I was going to retire because I thought it might be redundant, but then I watched some films at the weekend and realised it isn't. And it comes from helping a friend's daughter with some GCSE coursework about feminism and films. And so we were listing all the cliches of Hollywood films in relation to gender. It sounds like it's a very long poem because it says 21 points, but it's not. 21 points for a feminist essay on film. 1. Something small to say, and mostly us to say it. 2. We gather dessert spoons in sticky bouquets. 3. We hear disturbance in the basement and still we take a candle and go down. 4. We're innocent, if only to ourselves, and want to know the strangeness of our houses. 5. No one breathes until the hemlines go up. 6. Off with our glasses and oh my, we are delivered to ourselves like roses. 7. It's the softness of our bodies. 8. It's all of us laid end to end in a Mobius strip of skin and celluloid that kicks the whole shebang off. 9. We know when to run by the state of our shoes. 10. If everyone's shoes are sweet, we stay. 11. We may come like someone's pulled a ripcord from our bellies and go, yes! Or 12. A lawyer enters. E.g., do we say no in the way Plato himself would say no? 13. Here's our archive of equivocal sounds. 14. The original problem, of course, is mother. 15. Or the workplace. 16. Anyway, to do with mothers or employment will be why some guys still creeping up our shady stair like black mold. 17. He'll call it retribution, and they'll count this. 18. So we work real hard to be good astronauts and cyborgs, lining up our gleaming corsetry across the world's bridge. 19. Sister, warrior, this hypothesis will oust us from the family. 20. Never mind, it's only true in movies. 21. Will someone press the little button?
Thank you, Tiffany. This is such a varied reading. And if you have any questions you'd like to put to the poets at the end, do put them in the chat line and we'll see what we can cover at the end. And now I'd like to hand over to Aoife.
Hi. So the first poem I'm going to start with is called Octopus, although unofficially I've come to know it as the fourth octopus, because with babies, they very much like the tentacles to wrap around themselves. So when I had learned the fact that's in the poem, I went and I bought an octopus for myself. My husband decided it should go to the soon-to-be-born child. So I bought myself another octopus, but because that one smelled like me, that's the one the child actually wanted. So I was given a third octopus for my birthday, and then my daughter claimed that for herself. So this is the fourth octopus, so this is the one I get to keep. Octopus. They crochet them for premature babies. It stops the lonely reach and tug of the thin plastic lifelines on the neonatal wards. They find instead the thick pulsing twist of an umbilical octopus and wrap their fists around its tentacles, calmed by the curling thoughts of their absent mothers. So I tell the man behind the till it's for you, this plush octopus, all tentacles and soft stitching. Home, price pulled off and care label cut. I rest him on the marbled coral of my stomach. I watch him float on the tide of rising limbs that twist and curl beneath him. My octopus, my Omphalos buoyed by the living current. And this poem was written with the myth of the salmon of knowledge in mind, the idea being that when you caught it, you would get all the knowledge of the world. Afterbirth. The room is awash with pediatricians and surgeons. They cut and stitched like fishermen, gut and clean like fishermen's wives. Your father plucks you from their blue-green sea, your skin still salmon pink from the struggle. And when he kisses you for the first time all at once, his eyes fill with the knowledge of the whole world in his hands. This next poem is called Minute and Far Away and was written, or certainly composed, in the long, long hours that I would stay awake in the middle of the night so the baby would sleep. Through the heavy fog of broken sleep, I see them. Reflected in the kitchen cupboard, their green light appears and disappears across the room. Always on standby, theirs is a silent siren song. I sense it all, the cup, the capsule, the coffee, the milk froth and spooned on top with just a touch of cinnamon. I live in the potential of that first sip for hours while you sleep on me, stopped only by the knowledge that the push and puncture will wake the house and leave us all diminished. This penultimate poem is called Silt, and I wrote it because it was something I had noticed with my firstborn but had forgotten about until my youngest was born. And there's a stage for about 6 weeks where they just seem to always have dirt in between their fingers, but they don't go anywhere because they're not moving around. And then just it vanishes as quickly as it appears. Silt. It gathers in the riverbeds and basins of your hands. You hold it tight in your small fist. It is the tenuous grasp you have on the world, and you resist when I try to loosen it. Asleep, I unfurl each newborn finger, and with the tip of my smallest nail, lift the daily sediment away. Beneath the long lines of your life, your head, your heart run still and deep. Your future mapped out in miniature, tucked into the steadfast folds and creases of your palms. And the poem that I would like to finish with was written after attending a dear friend's wedding. Marfield House, the 6th of September, 2019. They gather around us like bridesmaids, and I, the mother bride. Precious as a bouquet, they lift you into their arms, take turns to walk you down and up the aisle, show you the hydrangeas, the wedding cake, yourself practicing vowels in the mirror. Slow danced through dinner, They woo you between courses and tables with the smiles they save for their children, all sound asleep elsewhere. When it is time for us to leave, they return you to me, delicate, fragrant, sleeping flower, curled into yourself like a white rose, all easy breaths and unfurled folds. The bride and groom dance on, love rising and expanding like bread. I save a slice for later, and we slip away unseen.
Thank you, Aoife, very much. And now we will have Susan Wicks reading the last segment of the readings before we go to questions and discussion. Susan.
Thank you, Neil. As you've gathered, the collection has a series of prose poems running through it, which are all addressed to this crane, which came and took up residence very, very close to the back of our house about a couple of years ago, and stayed there for just over a year, I think, and really became part of my life as I looked out at it all the time. But anyway, I'm going to read 3 of those short prose poems, 1 now and then 2 at the end. And this is the first one. They're sort of scattered throughout the collection. Dear Crane, at 8 a.m. in winter, barely light, you're at your post already, turning above our streets and dribbling cable. Somewhere out of sight, a platform swings across. The man in saffron stands and waits and beckons, seems to bless the new foundations with his hand. Grant us a concrete slab, a girder. Grant us a stack of pipes knotted together. Grant us perpetual growth from 6 to 4 feet under into human headroom, 1, 2 stories, 3. Grant us a bank of windows looking east and west, across the street downhill to where the older houses cluster, where your early morning congregation raise their bubbling kettles almost in unison. Somewhere an aging woman sees you take on flesh inside her little wreath of steam and murmurs to herself, dear Crane. This one's a more personal poem. I think it may be slightly mysterious to those of you who don't know John Wyndham's work, but his fantasy novels were extremely well known to anybody my age or over, I should think. So anyway, it's a poem about, it's more personal, it's about my own adolescence and my grandmother's dramatic mental breakdown when I was a teenager. Nethen, it refers to Nethen in it, and that's the name of the county asylum, the Surrey County Asylum at Hooley. Midwich Cuckoo, after John Wyndham. I read it on my camp bed in our kitchen on a day my nana wasn't quite herself, when she'd talked all night. Between the pages, I can still smell canvas, feel the wooden frame behind my knees, the quarry tiles still cold in sunlight slanting from the garden. That was my day out from school. For what? I wasn't sick exactly, only frightened, 15, hiding inside that transparent dome where everyone was either dead or sleeping, till the world eventually awoke and all the women, even virgins, even the unmarried, found themselves with child. I was that child, a gold-eyed Eric or Priscilla, asking to survive and ruthless, sharing every thought. Together, we would find my life, my clothes, my bedroom, where my nana's voice had finally gone quiet. And at any moment, Dr. Hughes would come with an official letter and they'd drive her down to Nethen. I would find an explanation for that last crusade, the villagers at one another's throats or slavering, the impulse that could make a pilot and his crew bail out on parachutes and float to earth in safety while their unmanned plane flew on. And this one's set in Greece. Credo. Rounding the headland on our way back, we saw it standing sideways on a ledge of rock above the waterline in a small cave, so still and delicate it looked sculpted out of marble. "That's not real," you said. And I said, "Yes, it is." It turned its head and seemed to see us. Goat. After all these years, I think you still believe in saints enshrined in niches, subtle enough to cheat the eye, the strands of stone that mimic hair or fur, the lineaments of skeleton and sinew. Even now you find them miraculous. While I, what is it I believe in? Here from this small boat on swaying water, if I can believe in anything, it's something rank and warm and full of blood that jumps from crag to crag over the churning surf and turns its silly head and leaps and risks a stumble, climbs and climbs until it reaches what? A narrow jut of rock it surely can't escape from, but somehow it can, it will. And yes, in fact, I do believe in this, in something never yet enshrined or chiseled. I believe in goat. And then the two last, I'm going to end with these two last Dear Crane poems. This one is horribly close to my very recent experience, I'm afraid. Dear Crane, when I lie down to sleep, you stand astride my forehead like a ladder stretching up between the stars, a geometric ladder or a beanstalk, or a ladder where the dreams fly in and out like birds, like leaves, like birds, until I wake and see your high red light. From there, I look back down and see your feet receding, watch them turning clockwise through the eyes of someone younger, stoned or drunk. Someone my age with inflammation of the middle ear. I see the whole dark world slip sideways as I try to walk away towards my what? My midnight destiny, my younger life, my midnight Christ, before I have to stop and kneel at this ceramic bathroom fitting to throw up. And the one I'm going to end with, Dear Crane, at first we fail to notice anything has changed. It's only when we're walking back that I look up and see that where your see-through body used to stand, there's only see-through. Where your metal heart would dangle on a ground of cloud, there's only cloud. Your slewing unit slewed itself and gone. It's what you do, erase yourself, move on to where you're needed. Now no shadow of a tower falls across the roofs. Our sky is heartless as it always was. The building still unfinished, webbed in scaffolding, its plastic sheeting flaps. Yet something glints. A new glazed window finds the evening sun. The rest's for us to manage. Your work's done.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you all for those lovely readings. We're going to move into discussion mode now. So Pete, our amazing techie, is going to manage that for us. I'd also like to say that, of course, at the moment, authors are not earning very much money in lockdown because they're not doing readings apart from online readings. And it's really helpful if you will buy their books at the end of the event. And on the YouTube page, you'll find links below to scroll down and you'll be able to order them right away from the Bloodaxe website. So if you enjoyed tonight's reading, please do buy maybe at least one book by one of these wonderful poets we've been hearing tonight. We've got some good questions, and I think we're about to go into the question mode. So I'll just stop talking now and hopefully we will have that shift happen. Everyone is on screen, but I can't see it. So just looking at some of the questions. Hang on, if Fleur could mute for the moment because of the interference. Right, that's okay. Yes, we've got a question, an interesting one from Dor Cipher, who says, beautiful readings, thank you. Can you describe the process of curating your collections and how that changed from collection to collection for those of you who've written more than one? And I know from my knowledge of all your work that your collections have all been quite different, and they have been differently structured, different subject matter. They are, they really show development from one to another. And I think this is also a question that we could put to Aoife, because what people mightn't know is that when Aoife sent me her collection, and because it related so much to her own experience, what I said to her was, I don't think we should publish it this year or next year. I think we should hold it back another year, because what you're writing about, you're still experiencing. So that was unusual in that the curation of her collection was involved actually holding the book back because it was in a sense still writing itself. So perhaps one of you can come in on this and talk about how you've created your collections. We could unmute Fleur and start with Fleur.
I was hoping you wouldn't, because I don't think I've got anything. Well, they're all different, you see. I was much more interested in other people's collections. I loved the way Susan's had the deer crane running all the way through, because I actually came back from New Zealand just over a year ago, and there was a crane, a red light shining in the sky, and so I've shared her crane from a distance. The only collection I actually set out with the idea of writing as a unit was the land ballad about my father's teenage childhood, milking cows up in the bush in New Zealand, and various other family things that went into that. World War I came into it, and because it was during World War I. Other times, this current collection, I think this may be the last one, so I was concerned with clearing the desk so that I would make up my own mind about what was going to be in this book, thank you very much, and not leave it to my poor executors to do. So I just bundled them all together and put them all in, and well, altered them. And the centre of it was the ones for Roy, which gave it a point, really. Otherwise, it would have been just a rag bag. And I realised that, as I said during the reading, a lot of them are about death because of the stage I'm at in my life. I love the fact that all the people doing this reading are all at different phases in their career. And I can't think of a group of people I'd rather be with. I'm so pleased to see them all. I can see only face I can see on the screen is Aoife, and I can see her smiling. But and I am welcoming her. Otherwise, no, I haven't got anything relevant for the future. But I'll pass over to somebody else.
Aoife, do you want to comment since we mentioned it?
Sure. I suppose, like Neil said already, I had submitted the first phase of the manuscript to be considered when I was still expecting my son, and he wrote back and he said he was interested and could I send the full manuscript. And I waited for about 8 weeks, and since we're among friends, I'll confess, Neil, that I wasn't quite as close to my due date as I said I was when I wrote to you to ask for a response. I think I was 4 or 5 weeks further on, or further behind than I maybe had intimated. You were very good. But what happened initially was what Neil had said. He said, this is still an experience you're having, would you be willing and open to keep writing? And because I had decided in my head the collection was finished, I actually hadn't written or had written very little in the kind of the 8 weeks in the middle. And as soon as he said, you know, this is still happening, this is a new experience, then, you know, the next day I sat down and I wrote Octopus. And it's one of those poems that was written in a day. You get maybe 1 or 2 a year where that happens. And that was start to finish the next day. And it allowed for a huge transformation, because it allowed it to be a separate experience. So while the collection reads as being quite linear and quite a clear narrative, it's a mixture of poems written when I was expecting my daughter, and then when she was little, and the same with my son as well. So there was a huge change. I think the initial full collection had 48 poems in it. And then 18 months later, I sent something back to Neil, and I had taken 18 poems out and I'd added 30 new ones. I had changed the structure around, I changed the order around. So it was very much curated in that sense, that I wanted a sense of a narrative going from start to finish, which not all poetry collections would have, but I wanted certain poems to come in because they made sense, that something about the child being very young should appear before a poem about the child learning to walk. So that's a very kind of clear structure that I set out for. But even the 2 days before I sent Neil the final manuscript, I was taking poems out and moving them around. So it really didn't settle until I was told to stop now.
There was also that poem Acrania, which was like the starting point of the book, which was the first poem, and it became the last poem. Mm-hmm. Because of what changed politically, wasn't it?
It was a mixture of what changed politically, and it was a poem that I had written before I'd experienced pregnancy loss for myself. It's really the only poem in the collection that came from a kind of a persona perspective of me trying to imagine what that must be like. And it was very much a sense of thinking that there was a level of duty or responsibility to record things as they were happening, because even you know, a month or 2 on, when you have small children, you kind of go, how old were they when that happened, and when did this happen, and you know, when did they roll over, when did they stand up, and all of those things can get lost. So this book was very much about capturing those small kind of moments for myself, but Acrania was really a starting point of saying that this is something that it needs to be paid attention to. And it needs to be examined, it needs to be interrogated. As we've all learned in the last year, systems can change, you know, if they have to, if they need to. And very much the next book that I'm looking at is far more an interrogation of the systems in which those conditions existed or were made to exist, that are in that first collection. So again, it has an overarching idea, but the poems that go into it, I have no control over. I have poems in that book that were written in 2015, and the next poem was written in 2021. But on a timeline, they're 3 weeks apart. So it's very interesting to go through it from that point of view.
Thank you. Tiffany, maybe you could talk about the curating of your books, because they've all been very different, haven't they?
Yeah, I think curating is quite a grand term for what, in my case, I think is just like sifting out the crap of poems, really, and not having a narrative structure. It's really interesting what Aoife was just saying about narrative, and what you said about it, Neil, that Aoife's collection is all the richer for having that extended narrative structure, and it makes for a very satisfying, very moving read because of where it starts and where it ends. And I think that's really necessary. None of my collections I would call narrative, so I haven't had to worry about that, but 2 of them have had sequences as half, and then the other half as standalones, which makes the job a lot easier because you don't need to sort of work with narrative expectation or anything like that. But mostly it's just been then a case of sort of pruning and trimming. Is my experience where I've appreciated the help that I've had from my editor and from others.
In your case, you had your hospital residency and you had the medicine unboxed poems and so on. And one of the other questions that's come through is, and for you and all the poets, but probably particularly for you, is how you handle permissions, in quotes, using real people's found conversations. Is it fair game to actually take stuff and then put it into poems, or in a disguised form? Do you have worries about that when you put the work together, or even when you're writing the work?
It's a really good question, and there are lots of kind of grey areas there. I mean, in the case of the hospital residency, permissions were very significant. I mean, it was a requirement. So I didn't actually record anybody, but I took notes and I asked them, whoever I spoke to said, are you happy for me to use fragments of this material? I didn't even know how I was going to use it. And also said that I would make available the text when it was finished. And everyone said, I was very surprised by this. Everyone was like, yeah, whatever, you know, if it's any use. Most people were very dismissive of actually of what they'd said and thought it wouldn't be of any use. So, so there was that. But above and beyond that, I mean, I was also looking through all of our collections and looking at the notes at the back, and where, you know, there are references made to the what's the word, the kind of stimuli for a lot of the poems, and they are other people's words. And I think it's quite important to have a register of that somewhere, to have it noted somewhere. I don't think I'm fairly sure with the hospital poems, any of that is exactly verbatim. It's a slightly fictionalized account with people's permission to use it. But that took quite a long time, you know? and I am aware that we all write poems without doing that. And it's a tricky ethical issue sometimes, isn't it? Yeah, so I don't have a very clear answer to that, other than that each poem sort of presents itself as a new case, and you kind of work it out as you go along, in my experience, but I don't know what others' experiences of that.
Well, we've not heard from Susan yet. If you could maybe talk about the way you've structured your books. Also, your last book used your daughter's experience. So I wonder whether that was an issue that you had in relation to that work.
Well, that was very different. For the months, you mean, was the one book that I think I've structured very consciously, because I had this old diary. I destroyed all my years old diaries, but I'd kept this one volume because it seemed special, because it was during my pregnancy when I had my elder daughter, and I kept, you know, I have more recent diaries that I then get rid of. But I sort of intercut the two, and that seemed to give a natural structure. My first month with her and her first month with Robin, and then it sort of went on from that, all intercut. And I had all the kind of small, detailed information I wanted, really. I didn't want a big global look at things. I wanted it sort of to grow from the immediacy of the small detail all the time. So that was very conscious, and I was lucky that I had the raw material that was not particularly conscious to work with. But usually my books are it's more like making pastry, I think. Not that I make pastry very often these days. I used to when I was younger. But you know, you add a little bit of moisture, a little bit of sort of elbow, and then it suddenly starts to clump together. And it's telling you something, and I think a poetry book is a bit like that. When it starts to clump, you're noticing that it's clumping and that the texture is right, and you're noticing what the substance is that is clumping, so that you know how the rest will sort of go with it. I think it's very instinctive. It's not a bit like curating, really. It's much more hands-on than that somehow.
That question about permissions came from Ken Evans, so thank you, Ken, for that. And Sarah Corbett has a question for you and for Fleur, but I think Fleur's already answered it from her point of view, is what for you sustains a long career in poetry?
What sustains it?
What sustains a long career in poetry?
Well, I that's the question I've wanted to ask Fleur. I think it's self-confidence, basically. I think that's the crucial thing. I think there are many, many moments when you're on the cusp and you feel you're going to give up. So what sustains it is just that self-belief. And for me, it's been doing residencies, mainly in America, where I've gone away and somebody has been investing money in me, I suppose, indirectly, and making me feel that I was, in fact, a poet, when everything at home was telling me I wasn't. And that's been hugely important during my whole career. And now I can't go to America. And so this is probably the time when I give up.
You also published late, didn't you? You started, your first collection came out quite late. You weren't a young poet in that,
No, I was
sense
in
of
my
publishing.
early 40s. And it was after my first American residency that I sort of summoned up the courage, I think. But I've been writing novels since I finished my PhD when I was about 25. And not quite successfully. I'd had an agent and hadn't had them published. So I'd been writing, but I hadn't been writing poetry. I didn't realize poetry was a thing that women wrote. I didn't do any poetry by women at school or at university, indeed. It didn't seem real that I would go away and write poetry.
Well, that's something.
One of my students took me to a workshop once, a poetry workshop, and I didn't know what it was. And that was my first introduction to it.
Well, thankfully that's all changed, isn't it? Fleur, do you want to chip in?
Yes. Can I say, well, I was going to say something about poetry workshops before. I love Tiffany's poem about the poetry workshop, but it's not my experience. We didn't do all that sort of stuff when I was young. You just wrote, read books and then wrote. And well, as you'll have gathered from my very early experience of the stuff. But what sustained me in a way has been confidence. If you get a poem published or somebody responds favorably to a book, then you suddenly find you can write again, as Susan was saying. Also, experiences and traveling. For me, this lockdown, I've hardly written a thing since I've been locked up. I've had all this time and I haven't been anywhere. I haven't got a train. I haven't gone for a walk outside the bounds of my local parish. And I haven't been abroad. Not that I'd particularly want to go abroad, but I had planned to go to lots of places in England, have communications with people. And there aren't any people coming in to my world. So experiences are not arising.
We've got a question about... hang on, Fleur, can you mute for a second? Yep, sorry. Fleur's computer makes me sound echoey. Agnieszka Studecka, the notion of pain is immediate and prevalent in both Aoife and Tiffany's work. Is this a theme that you think will haunt your work, or has it haunted your work in different guises? And Sarah Corbett also asks Aoife whether Ivan Boland was an influence because of Ivan Boland's important poems about motherhood. So perhaps Tiffany and Aoife can chip in on pain and Ivan Boland.
Sure. The short answer for Ivan Boland is yes. She was a female poet that I studied in school. It was herself and Emily Dickinson. So that was kind of my first exposure to women writing poetry, and it was Child of Our Time that really stuck in the back of my head for years and years and years. And it kind of like what Susan was saying, when you're wanting to write something and nobody else is writing about it, you almost feel apologetic about it. You can go, oh, I know all the big people haven't written about this, but I think it's kind of important. And these are the kind of things that I think are worth kind of interrogating and representing in a literary landscape. And particularly with Ivan Boland, I was sitting down and I was reading, her essays about being an Irish woman. And, we grew up in similar circumstances and we went to the same college and kind of grew up in the same area of Dublin, although be it at different times. And it was very much her idea of going, I'm not a poet who's a mother, I'm a mother poet. I'm not trying to separate the two, because that's something I struggled with, was going, well, if I want to be anything I want to be, they all have to be separate and compartmentalized. So if I'm a mother, I can only be a mother. And if I'm something else, I can only be something else. Whereas poetry was a way of having both, of being part of a literary community and landscape, and also being a mother. And being able to reconcile the two as well. I thought Agnieszka's question was quite interesting, in the sense that I wouldn't say my work is haunted by the pain, because it's very much a deliberate showing. And the reason I wrote the poems and read them tonight, that they don't get any easier to read over time, but it's about taking that pain out of the shadows and giving it attention and looking after it. And I think that's, for me, is a very important thing, because I know a lot of women who are suffering a lot of pain and they say nothing. And there are friends and family who don't say anything because they don't know what to say. They don't have a reference point. So in that sense, I'd say it's not about that haunting, but it's actually taking away that fear of being able to talk about it. And being able to say, I have experienced pain, I am in pain, I have pain. And whether you see it or don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. But it is an influence, and people who've read the book will know that it does come back up, and it does influence how later poems are read. But and I think a lot of people with lockdown are realizing that these are the things we can't and shouldn't have to bury to make other people more comfortable, because it's just a rod for your own back. And I think there's a lot of people who feel the same way.
Yeah, I included 2 of those poems in the Staying Human anthology, which was published last year. And I also included poems on the same subject by Sandeep Palmer and Fiona Benson and Rebecca Goss, because it seemed to me an area that hadn't been well shown in poetry books. But also that whole area of poets writing about motherhood and childbirth, until the last probably 20 years, it just wasn't being published because of the way in which publishing was ruled by male editors that weren't interested in what poets actually wanted to write and what readers wanted to hear about. Did you feel as though you were kind of breaking through at that? I mean, in the way that Kate Clancy did with Newborn, which was very nastily reviewed by some critics.
I think in the way Fleur was saying about how she develops her collections, and Susan and Tiffany, it's an impulse to do it, and in my case, it was a need to be seen and allow other people to be seen as well. I performed the first sequence about 2 months after I had written them, after the loss. And a woman from the audience left in the middle, and she came to find me afterwards and said that she had just gone through the same thing. It turns out we were basically on the ward at the same time, but she hadn't been able to tell anyone because nobody knew she was pregnant. And she said that now she could tell people that she'd seen me and she'd heard me reading, and she could use that as a way to tell people what had happened to her. And I was worried that the collection wouldn't be picked up. I was worried that it would be dismissed as being too focused, but I kept doing it because I had to, and that was the thing that Neil liked about it. So when people say, write the thing that you need to write, you can be afraid of it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Tiffany, if we could turn to you, are you going to be haunted by pain in your work?
Not in the same way, because I think, first I wanted to say about what Eva was saying there about that kind of pain, that, that it's a tremendous consolation to read those poems. And that's a slightly separate issue, I think, from the kind of sort of pain that I think is referred to in my work, which is a specific kind of problem of language, as I think linguistic philosophy would describe it, that it's very difficult to put physical pain into language. It's a kind of a well-known statement by, I think, Elaine Scarry originally, but subsequently taken up by medical professionals and so on. And the pain that I was writing about wasn't mine, which makes a huge difference as well. I mean, clearly I have experienced pain, but my kind of curiosity was about how people do in fact find ways to use language to be very clear. Actually, it's just that the language isn't kind of denotative and clear in the way that we might want it to be, but it's much more creative. So for me, it started out actually as quite an intellectual question, but of course, as you encounter people and you hear their stories, it becomes something else. So in the end, those boundaries became a bit fuzzier, but I felt I'd kind of sort of satisfied some of that curiosity. So I don't know if it will. I don't know if it haunts the first collection, for one thing, and I don't know how it might arise in others. It felt like quite a self-contained question, but I don't know. It's too soon to say, I think.
Yeah, we had a question actually from, I think it was Sarah Corbett again, saying, what prompted you to actually take that residency?
Nosiness, and I think, and curiosity, and actually an opportunity. At the time I lived in Wales, and there was a kind of a local government initiative to put people from workplaces in other workplaces. And at the time I worked at the university, and basically the question was, sort of fantasy football thing, where would you like to go? And I thought, I just want to sit in the hospital, because obviously you're not allowed to do that normally. It would be a really weird thing to do. And it became possible. So it was a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity to have clearance, as it were, to hang around and just to ask questions and to listen to people. And for their part, they were interested in the time at kind of the patient charter and improving the patient experience. So a lot of the reporting back I did of people's experiences was allegedly helpful for them. But it was a kind of a one-off, and it wasn't an official residency. It's just that's the term that's kind of easiest to describe it. Just sitting around and listening in most of the time.
Yeah. I think we've used up all the questions that have been fed through to me now. So one thing we do in these events is we ask the poets who are taking part whether they have any questions they want to ask each other about their work or about what they've heard tonight. So does anyone have any questions that they'd like to finish off by asking any of the other poets?
I had one for Fleur. If I could ask, and it's, you mentioned and you showed us at the start your first poetry collection from when you were 7. And my question was at that the point that you kind of knew that poetry was going to be this, very strong theme or very strong part of your life going forward? Because it's something I figured out about myself in retrospect, going, maybe not all kids kept collections of poems they liked in notebooks. But it was 10 years after college.
It was at the time. I was writing poems, or I didn't call it writing because I didn't write to begin with. I made them up. They were in my head. I'll read the first one in this, one of my first creations. Fairies, little fairies dancing on the bridge today. We find them over the ocean far, far away. Well, that's a poem because it rhymes. And I was doing that sort of stuff. It was partly because I was having a bad time at school. I was at a new school. I went to 11 different schools in England during the war for, war reasons. And the boys were torturing the girls at lunchtime. The teachers went away, and I had my little notebook and I wrote in it. And it was my escape from the world. And every time I was at a new school, I could write poems and create things. So, and then it begins to become public because somebody asks you to do one for something at school, and I wrote a poem about the Pilgrim Fathers, and I got a gold star. So public approval. I was 9 then. So it's all just gradually. I always knew poetry was going to be happening, whatever else my career options or my social options. But poetry was what I did. So it's being an introvert, maybe. Is it that? Something like that. But...
Thank you. Anyone else? Tiffany.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. It's going to be a slightly hard question, but I really want to know the answer. And it's to do with lockdown and being a writer in these circumstances, and how have you dealt with this, fellow people? What's it done to your reading, your writing? Has it been important to think about in your work? I wonder if maybe Fleur feels she's partially answered this question already because she spoke about it a bit earlier, but I'm just really curious to know what it's honestly kind of what it's done to each of your sense of your work and what it's for and where it belongs. All of those big questions, really, but in any order and in any level of detail.
Susan, maybe? You're still muted.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can't tell what's due to lockdown and what's just due to being at the stage I am anyway. But I think there have been times lately when I've certainly wondered what I was doing. But I think that's kind of healthy. That's like growth rings on a tree, and eventually that will work its way out, and the process will start again. And I think especially when you've got a book pending, it's actually very hard to feel creative about the next thing. I don't know whether other people find that, but I mean there is a lot less stimulating input than there would normally be in times where we weren't locked down. So that's one thing I've missed, I think. And also paradoxically, there's been less stress and less pressure, so that if ever you do have to try and put yourself under pressure, I found that extremely difficult. But I keep writing little bits, and they become more whimsical, I think. And I don't know whether that's an invitation or a danger, but we'll see. It's nowhere near clumping yet like pastry, Neil, so you don't need to worry.
But also, all your books were finished before lockdown, so in a sense, you had the books before you when you went into lockdown, didn't you? Although it sounds as though Aoife's moving forward. Is that right?
I am now, and actually I think it's very much about kind of what Tiffany and Susan were saying, that I was keeping notes all along, because I found myself in some very kind of surreal circumstances where I was, the kids were drawing at the table, I was cooking dinner, and I'd have, Lem Sisse was on top of the microwave on my laptop, because I was tuning into an event, but I still had to do all of these other things in my life. So all of these things were coming together in one place and felt very, very interesting, quite strange. So what I did keep doing was I kept writing things down and making notes. But I think it will be a long time before those notes come to anything. I couldn't do anything beyond a first draft for probably 8.5 solid months, 9 months almost. And it was the arrival of the physical copies of Mother Nature that again just seemed to take off a little pressure that said, it's real, it's here, it's done, on you go. Because of course there was more uncertainty about, if things were going to get moved around with lockdown and various things as well. But no, I did find for about 9 months I could make notes, but I couldn't turn anything into anything. One day I managed to get to a 4th draft of something and I had to go for a nap, because my brain was, and I think part of it with poetry, and I know novelists as well who've really struggled with this, is certainly for me, when I get that kind of feeling, which was a question I was going to ask, is I need to be able to relax boundaries and I need to let things wander and mix and match. But when you're being hyper vigilant and you're having to pay attention to how close people are or what's on the shelf or who's touched, your brain is trying to compute all of this information. It physically won't let itself relax because or you've got the kids in the shop, or did you bring your mask, is it in the glove, it's that stuff, but all the time. And I know a lot of novelists as well as poets have struggled with that, because the brain has just gone, it's not the time.
Thank you. Maybe we could finish with Tiffany answering her own questions and then we can wind up. How's lockdown been for you?
That's really interesting. I love that point about hypervigilance, that kind of hypervigilance doesn't kind of turn into a sort of creative hyperactivity, sadly, or certainly hasn't for me. I think I don't know is the answer, because now that I think of it, I don't know, as Susan said, how to measure what's lockdown and what's just, other things. But I think we were all lucky that we had something in the bag before we went into it. Mm-hmm. But I do feel a sort of pressure that there is a job there about articulating something about the state of things now that is going to work on all of us, all writers probably, but it might be a long time coming. But I've certainly found it a good time to catch up with a lot of reading I should have done years ago, like whole oeuvres of people that I ought to have read a long time ago. So that was helpful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Tiffany Atkinson, Fleur Adcock, Aoife Lyall and Susan Wicks for their lovely readings and for this very interesting discussion, and encourage the audience to scroll down their YouTube page and order some of the books. So thank you very much for coming to the event. And if you want to tell friends about it, very shortly after the end of the event, it will be available on YouTube to watch after the live stream. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.